I'm going to talk about Judaism and modernity, how the values of Judaism, in my view, are so important to our current way of life. I want to start by observing that it's an article of faith, isn't it? That religion and modernity are supposed to be mutually exclusive. So you've got, like, in one box marked modernity are supposed to be all the good things that we value: reason, rationality, intelligence, progress, science, justice, compassion, freedom. In the other box marked religion are only bad things: irrationality, obscurantism, superstition, repression. So I don't know whether you will have read the book by the famed biologist, Professor Richard Dawkins, called The God Delusion. But in that book, Professor Dawkins blamed the God of the Old Testament for absolutely everything bad in the world. He wrote, I quote, "The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction, jealous and proud of it, petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully," close quote. Now, in the last few years, there's been a tremendous onslaught on religion in the West, on the basis that it stands in the way of the betterment of the world and the happy and healthy development of the individual. Religion is deemed to just get in the way of the good life. Some years ago, the humanists launched their Atheist Bus campaign, which featured a bus which bore on its side the message emblazoned in large letters: "There's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life." Well, I particularly like the probably bit, because it seemed to me that even the atheists weren't absolutely sure there was no God, which I thought possibly meant they weren't really atheists at all. But anyway, put that to one side. The point they were making was that religion gets in the way of your enjoying your life. Now, why should that be? Well, the answer is that religion has all those tiresome rules which prevent people from doing exactly what they want, whenever they want, regardless of anyone else. The moral codes of the Bible fettered the individual's proclaimed right to live exactly as they want, with no one to tell them they're wrong. And over the past 5 or 6 decades, there's been a determined attempt to lock up those biblical principles in that awful box marked smelly old religion and throw away the key. In their place have come a range of ideologies, man-made ideas such as individualism, the belief that there's nothing higher than individual rights; moral and cultural relativism, the belief that there's no such thing as objective truth and that no one's values are better or worse than anyone else's; transnationalism, the idea that the very idea of a nation state is wrong; materialism, the belief that there is absolutely nothing in the world, the universe and beyond that doesn't have a material reality. Now, secular people claim that secularism invented all the things that we think are good about our society, or that those good things were invented by the Greeks, or that we're all kind of somehow born with them, with noble instincts, and that religion destroys all those noble instincts. Well, I want to argue the precise opposite of all this. I want to argue that the source of our core values in the West, respect for human life, justice, compassion, freedom, rationality, and the development of science, all originated in the Hebrew Bible. Without that, civilized values would not exist, which is why every terrible regime in the world has either ignored the precepts of the Bible or actively sought their overthrow. My argument is that Judaism isn't a marginal outlier or a hindrance to Western civilization. It's the very basis of it. Its core principles come from Judaism, from the precepts and laws laid down in the Hebrew Bible, and which were then interpreted and codified by several centuries of rabbinic opinion. Look at the Greeks. The ancient Greeks thought that people were merely the playthings of the gods. The people weren't equal. There were strict hierarchies of human value. The punishments they meted out to offenders were often not just cruel, but barbaric. There was an almost total absence of empathy, of sympathy with other human beings just because they were human beings, and instead there was a distinct tendency towards dehumanization. By contrast, the Hebrew Bible gave us the revolutionary idea that every individual was worthy of equal respect. This came from its statement that humanity had been fashioned in the image of God. The Bible introduced for the first time the idea that human beings were superior to the animal kingdom. Why? Because human beings had moral responsibility. All were equal before God's law. So justice embodied fairness for everybody and gave rise to an understanding of and a reverence for justice as a principle. The Mosaic laws were a set of rules and precepts designed to create a community by putting the welfare of others before yourself. Now, putting first a duty towards others and consequently placing chains on your own wants and desires certainly constrains the individual, but it's only through such constraints that freedom, real freedom, can be created, because in the absence of such laws, we get anarchy, an endless kind of struggle for power between individuals and groups in which the weak are victimized by the strong in what Thomas Hobbes was to call a war of all against all. The Mosaic laws of the Bible were not enforced by some despotic authority. They were adopted voluntarily through individual self-discipline. This was again a revolutionary concept and gave the world the concept of individual accountability. So Judaism is at the heart of the West's signature principles of humane, orderly, and civilized behavior. But I would argue it made an even more fundamental contribution to our society. Because if the West has one overriding and defining characteristic, it's surely reason, rationality. This is inextricably connected to other things we associate with the West, like science, like progress, and modernity. Well, I'm suggesting to you that Judaism invented Western reason. Without Judaism, there would have been no Western science, progress, or modernity. Now, I'm sure many of you will be quite shocked to hear me say that, because how can this, you may ask, how can this possibly be? Everyone knows, don't they, that religion is just a load of superstitious, backward mumbo jumbo, and the only people who believe any of it are really a bit like stupid. And how can science have developed from the Bible? After all, other cultures have had science, nothing particular about Western science, surely, is there? Well, yes. I mean, it's true, of course, that other cultures have had science, but in those cultures, science hit a dead end because their core assumptions of those societies were entirely different. You see, there's a widespread belief that the roots of science lay in ancient Greece. Well, for sure. Greek thinking played a very significant role in the development of Western civilization, and important medieval Jewish and Christian thinkers sought to reconcile what the Greeks thought with their own religious precepts. But in key respects, it was Greek culture was also inimical to a rational view of the universe as we understand rationality to be. The Greeks, whose universe was an endless cycle of progress and decay, which transformed heavenly bodies into actual gods, explained the natural world by abstract general principles. Socrates thought empirical observation, looking at what was actually observable, was a waste of time, and Plato advised his students to, quote, leave the starry heavens alone. Well, the Hungarian Benedictine priest Stanley Jakey has shown that in 7 great cultures, the Chinese, Hindu, Mayan, Egyptian, Babylonian, Greek, and Arabic, the development of science was truncated. All of them made discoveries that carried human understanding forward. India produced decimal notation, ancient Greece, astronomy and geometry, and so on, but none of them was able to keep their scientific discoveries going. Now, Jakey attributed this failure to 2 critical features that these cultures had in common: a belief in pantheism and a cyclical concept of time. Science, he thought, could proceed only on the basis that the universe was rational and coherent, and thus nature behaved in accordance with certain unchanging natural laws. It was therefore impossible under pantheism, which ascribed natural events to the whims and caprices of the spirit world. But it was the Hebrew Bible which, in its account of creation, introduced the, again, revolutionary concepts which made rationality and scientific development possible in the West. Western science grew from the idea that the universe was rational, and that belief was given to us by the book of Genesis, which set out the, again, revolutionary proposition that the universe had a rational creator. Without such a purposeful intelligence behind it, the universe could not have been rational. There could have been no place for reason in the world because there would have been no truths or natural laws for reason to uncover. As the mathematician, Professor John Lennox has put it, quote, "At the heart of all science lies the conviction that the universe is orderly," close quote. Now, this absolutely fundamental insight came not from the Greeks, but thousands of years previously in the Hebrew Bible, with its proposition that the universe was governed by a single God rather than the whims of many gods. Another crucial factor for science was a linear concept of time. This meant history was progressive. Every event was significant. One thing led to another, and experience could be built upon. It was only the Hebrew Bible which introduced this concept of linear time and stopped us from literally going round and round in circles forever, and gave us the idea of progress, which was made possible by learning more about the laws of the universe. In the 12th century, the great Jewish sage Moses Maimonides explained in his Guide for the Perplexed that there was no contradiction between rationalism and the Hebrew Bible. He argued, for example, that the Torah was full of similes that were not to be taken as the literal truth, and he held that metaphysical truths, the truths of religion, could only be grasped through the exercise of reason, all of which is why the earliest scientists in Britain and Europe thought they were discovering God's laws through science. And it's why many, many scientists from the earliest times onwards have been Christians and Jews. It's why Francis Bacon said that God had provided us with two books, the book of nature and the Bible, and for that to be properly educated, one must study both. It's why Isaac Newton believed that the biblical account of creation had to be read and understood to understand science. It's why Descartes justified his search for natural laws on the grounds that they must exist because God was perfect and thus, quote, acts in a manner as constant and immutable as possible, close quote, except for the rare case of miracles, another story. It's why the German astronomer Johannes Kepler believed that the goal of science was to discover within the natural world, quote, the rational order which has been imposed upon it by God, quote, close quote, and why Galileo Galilei said, quote, the laws of nature are written by the hand of God in the language of mathematics. As C.S. Lewis wrote later on in history, quote, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver, close quote. Now, atheism, by contrast, holds that the world came from a random and therefore irrational source. So reason is an accidental byproduct, it's chance. So it's atheism, it seems to me, which actually leads us straight into the irrational. Now, these principles were very important in the formation of Western societies, Britain and America in particular. In Britain, early political thinkers grounded their principles in the Hebrew Bible. Oliver Cromwell, who brought the Jews back to England after centuries of exile, subscribed to the Puritans' reverence for the Hebrew scriptures. The 17th century political thinker John Selden found in Judaism a moral framework which underpinned his own thinking, arguing that Jewish tradition had so fixed and defined universal moral principles that it effectively offered a justification for all laws and traditions that didn't directly contradict those principles. In America, the Hebrew Bible is a conspicuous element of its foundational institutions and laws. The Liberty Bell has an inscription engraved upon it from Leviticus, from the book of Leviticus. It reads, "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land. unto all the inhabitants thereof. Jerusalem was built by King David as a common political symbol, unifying 12 tribes into one nation. He chose this neutral territory, then neutral territory of Jerusalem. It was neutral between the 12 tribes in order to unify them. And he then employed the physical founding of Jerusalem to unify those tribes politically in one nation, which is why ancient Israel has long been considered the kind of paradigm nation. It was the nation that kind of established the template for future successful nations, as opposed to a piece of land inhabited by various disparate and usually warring tribes or groups. Similarly, in the United States, its founding fathers decided to use the then neutral territory of Washington, D.C. As their capital in order to unify the quarreling colonies into one nation. And when he made his final address, President Ronald Reagan explicitly conjured up the image of Washington, D.C. as Jerusalem has often been depicted as, quote, the shining city on the hill, a romantic description, but nevertheless one that has great resonance for people who believe that America and also Britain were kind of created in the image of that original paradigm nation, the ancient kingdom of Israel. So in conclusion, I would say this. Of course, there are many things in Judaism with which we may not agree or of which we may mightily disapprove. There are continuing arguments over what particularly in Judaism is relevant to our culture today, how it can be adapted, how it can't be adapted, how it mustn't be adapted. These arguments will go on and on, probably without limit of time. But if you take away the core Jewish principles from society, what do you have instead? Well, we can answer that question quite easily through history by looking at those other cultures which have never had science or progress or modernity. And I would suggest it's because they haven't had these principles that I'm talking about. Progress is a Western thing. Modernity is a Western thing. Science, as we know it today, is a Western thing. And I would suggest that without Judaism, there could have been no science, no progress, and no modernity. What we're living through now in this great uproar that we've seen in the last few weeks and months in particular, and I would suggest going back much further than that in what we've seen in what's been taught over the last 4 or 5 decades about Western civilization and how rotten it is and all that. What we're living through now, I would suggest, is an onslaught on the core values of the West, at the root of which are the values of the Hebrew Bible, as I've tried to explain. Now, this onslaught has many causes, but what I want to say in particular at this point is that what's so striking about this onslaught, what unifies all these different ideologies and isms that are coming together in order to overturn precepts and principles of the hated West, what unifies them is that they all profess the highest possible ideals, which we should all support. For example, they are all about producing a more compassionate society, a society where there's equality rather than prejudice or bigotry, a society that's more free, more tolerant, more just. And, you know, I hope that there is none of us that would actually think that those ideals aren't noble ideals. We should all aspire to them. But what I'm suggesting is that, curiously, under the banner of all those things, we are actually lurching into their very opposite. We are lurching into a society in which group is set against group, where there is more hatred and division and intolerance, where all that is growing and where power is being abused, where people are being cancelled, deplatformed, fired, simply because others don't like their views. That, to me, is not a tolerant, just, or compassionate society, and it's not a society based on reason. Increasingly, one can't have a rational argument. Rational argument is being largely or significantly destroyed by, or replaced by people simply hurling insults, character assassination, and all the rest of it. I would suggest, therefore, that a society where the freedom to discuss and debate is being extinguished in the universities, the places which are supposed to be the crucible of free expression and the pursuit of knowledge, this is what our society is becoming. And instead of the universities being this crucible of knowledge and free expression, reason is itself being crushed under the pressure of aggrieved or offended feelings. And this, I believe, is, if it doesn't stop, augurs the extinction of not just certain key values, but of reason and rationality itself. What all this tells us, I think, in final conclusion, is that words such as freedom, justice, compassion, conscience, depend for their meaning on the Hebrew Bible from which they came. Once the Hebrew Bible is removed from the scene, those words become no more than empty slogans which serve as fig leaves to mask what is actually happening, which, to cut it short, is an abuse of power. And the proper use of power, a society founded upon liberty and justice and compassion and reason, are what Judaism alone first gave to the world. That's what the Jews did for everybody.